Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Derrell Peel analyzes weak international sales of U.S. beef. Bryce Anderson explains why moisture has been so abundant in Nebraska. Richard Randle talks about heat stress in cattle. And Brad Lubin discusses farm incomes and results from this year's Nebraska Rural Poll. Oklahoma State University livestock marketing specialist Derrell Peel is our cattle market analyst this week. We'll soon get the latest glimpse of the cattle industry as the USDA releases its July cattle report on Friday the 24th. January's cattle report showed an inventory 1% higher than the previous year. Farmers and ranchers attempting to rebuild herds have benefited from adequate moisture across many states. In fact, the country's pasture and ranges are in the second best condition on record. But international demand remains weak. U.S. beef and veal exports for the month of May were down more than 14% from May 2014. We started by asking why when we talked with Derrell Wednesday morning.
Well, I think on the beef side, it's a combination of the fact, of course, that with the tight supplies in the U.S., we've got essentially record prices. We're very close to record levels for cattle and for beef. And then we add on top of that the strong dollar that we've had. That discourages exports, makes our products even more expensive in the international markets, and it actually favors imports. And so we're seeing the impact of both of those factors right now in terms of the beef trade.
Do you think that can rebound?
Well, I think it will. I mean, obviously, it depends on what happens on both of those fronts. So we're keeping an eye on the strength of the dollar. It's kind of leveled out. I won't say it's moderated, and it probably won't. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty in the global macroeconomic environment, but it has stopped appreciating at least. It's kind of holding steady, and so that at least stops any additional pressure or reduces additional pressure. Record prices in the U.S. are going to continue for some time, so we'll continue to struggle a little bit in that respect.
Well, you're touching on this then. The next question, how would you describe cattle market prices, both live and feeder?
Well, I think, you know, on a big picture view on an annual basis, this is kind of a sideways year. In 2014, we had this tremendous appreciation across all of the cattle and beef markets. To get to these levels, we're moving more sideways this year, holding pretty steady. If you look at, you know, whether we look at wholesale beef prices, retail prices have continued to increase so far. And, you know, fed cattle prices, feeder cattle prices have generally moved more sideways than anything this year.
What does that mean for margins first in the feedlot and for the packer?
Well, again, you know, our margin operators, especially the feedlots and packers, both continue to struggle a bit. Feedlots have had the worst end of the deal for many months, and that continues right now with more strength on the feeder cattle prices that they're buying. They've done lots of things the last few months to try to minimize that impact by holding on to cattle a bit longer, feeding them to heavier weights so they don't have to go out and buy new, more expensive cattle. But they're going to continue to struggle. The margins really will be very tight for them. Packers, it's a little more of a short-term thing in terms of you know, week-to-week kinds of things. They don't own product as long typically, and so their margins have been a little more up and down. One of the things that's impacted packer margins this year has been the fact that we've seen significant weakness in the byproducts value this year.
What about for the cow-calf producer?
You know, again, cow-calf producers in the driver's seat, all eyes are really on the cow-calf sector because the market is providing this tremendous incentive to regrow the cow herd. You know, because of the drought and other things over the last few years, we've gotten a lot smaller than we intended to be. We got those prices up there last year, and we're responding this year, but it's going to continue for some period of time. So cow-calf producers there. Stocker producers generally have a pretty favorable margin, although, again, they are a margin operation, so you have to look at that a little more like the feedlot side. But from a forage-based standpoint, stocker margins still look reasonably attractive.
The USDA's cattle inventory report is next Friday. What do you expect it will show?
Well, we're anticipating, of course, that it will confirm continued herd expansion. We started herd expansion finally in 2014 with about a 2% increase in the beef cow herd. You know, the extent of that, we may push it to some very strong levels this year, but I think there's little doubt that we will see, you know, more heifers, more replacement heifers in the inventory report, and you know, a squeeze generally, or at least steady feeder cattle supplies. We did have an increase in the herd last year, so you know, we're expecting some increase in the calf crop in 2015. But when you balance that against the fact that we're going to save more of the heifer calves out of that for expansion, we probably won't see a big change in feeder cattle supplies.
What do you think it'll show down in Oklahoma and Texas, where drought has significantly been reduced?
You know, we saw a surprisingly large expansion last year, really more than I expected in that area, particularly down in Texas. We've had a lot of change this year, so I am looking for very, very aggressive expansion in some areas. I think on a nationwide basis, you know, we could see this thing jump up. You know, 3 to 4% expansion is certainly possible this year. That's not something we normally do for very many years in a row if you go back and look at you know, cattle cycles historically. But it's certainly possible this year for sure.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to analyze corn and soybean markets. Drought conditions bounce back slightly in Nebraska. According to the latest U.S. Drought Monitor, 4% of the state is now listed as abnormally dry. For other areas of the Corn Belt, too much moisture has started to drag condition ratings. Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana all experienced their wettest June on record. The rating of soybeans in poor to very poor shape now stands at 20% in Illinois, 22% in Ohio, and 26% in Indiana. Earlier this week, we talked with DTN's senior ag meteorologist Bryce Anderson to get an update on growing conditions, starting with a moisture update for Nebraska.
Moisture is really pretty decent across the state. Now there's still as a pocket of drier conditions in north central and northeastern Nebraska, and that's where we know that pretty much since the beginning of the real growing time frame for crops that the irrigation systems have been busy. But in the western part of the state, there have been some very abundant rains. South central has done well, and eastern Nebraska has done pretty well too. So, you know, you look at the state in general, and for this time of the season, this particular point in the year, that's a very good moisture supply overall.
How does it compare as you go farther to the east?
Well, as you go farther to the east and then to the southeast, it just gets wetter and wetter. And there's soils that are just 100% saturated now from about southeastern Iowa through just about all of Missouri, the southern 2/3 of Illinois, just about all of Indiana, and most of Ohio and into Kentucky. And obviously that southeastern part of the Corn Belt is where all the damage is because of too much rain.
And is that damage significant?
Yes, it is. There could be as many as 5 million acres of soybeans that are still in jeopardy. When you think about the percentage of poor to very poor conditions that have been reported now in the crop condition reports, that type of acreage is still at risk. And then corn has had numerous areas of ponding out, even in some of the better soils. And this is not a feature that completely goes away. I mean, it's one thing to talk about above average rains during June and so forth, but there were record rains in that portion of the Corn Belt by a large margin, and the crops are just not going to turn around and recover from that.
Why so wet? Because of El Nino?
El Nino was a big part of it, but Jeff, the general weather pattern that we had for the first half of this season was pretty much the weather pattern that we had from last winter. And that was powerful, high pressure along the western coast of North America, low pressure troughing over the Great Lakes and Hudson Bay. And so the storm track was already set up to be located over the southeastern part of the Corn Belt. And then El Nino came in, bringing in energy in the subtropical jet out of the eastern Pacific, and just sort of helped to supercharge the rainfall amounts that we had.
Compared to last year, and we talked about a year ago at this time, and we talked about the number of severe events that Nebraska had experienced. This year, not to tempt fate, but it really hasn't been like that. Is that because of El Nino?
In large part it is. El Nino kind of serves to moderate the overall temperature difference in the atmosphere, and so that is a big reason why things have been relatively milder. Now there are obviously parts of the state where to say it was a milder setup to the growing season, you know, there's going to be folks who say not so because of some of the horrendous flooding that we've seen. But as far as the occurrences of tornadoes and hail and damaging winds, it hasn't been anything nearly like we had last year.
What's the outlook for the rest of the summer look like?
Well, for the rest of the summer, there's you know, some brief rounds of heat that we have in the state. Here in mid-July. That's actually helped crops. I mean, crops are taking off finally, and we're going to be in good shape, I think, on growing degree day accumulation. But for the balance of the season, we're looking near normal on temperatures, kind of varying either side of that, and we're still going to be in a rainfall track. The high pressure focus is going to be in the southern plains from central Oklahoma south through Texas. We're going to be on the edge of that, and that means that we're going to be in the area where storms fire up, and we continue to get every so often shots of rain here.
Later in the show, Al Dutcher will provide his weekly weather forecast. It has been a warm week across much of Nebraska, with heat indices reaching above 100 degrees. Those high temperatures, coupled with light winds and humid conditions, could have caused problems for the state's cattle. At the ARDC Wednesday, we talked with Nebraska Extension beef veterinarian Richard Randle to learn more about how producers can better manage heat stress in cattle.
When we hit these real hot streaks where we have high temperatures, high humidity, and low air movement in terms of wind, it gives us a real problem with heat stress in these cattle.
Why is it worse, especially in the first few days of this week where we saw not only hot temperatures during the day but also at night?
Yeah, the real problem comes into, so these cattle start feeling the effects of heat stress when the environmental temperature reaches 70 to 75 degrees. As long as humidity is low and we have fairly cool nights, they have the opportunity to dissipate that heat. But when you get a combination where you have those high temperatures plus the humidity, the cattle can't handle that nearly as well. And on top of that, when you get situations where during the nighttime that temperature doesn't drop below what we figure to be 70 degrees, then they don't have the opportunity to dissipate that heat. So 2 or 3 days in succession like that, it's a real heat stress emergency on these cattle.
What things can producers do specifically in the feedlot that could maybe mitigate losses of animals?
Well, the two things that we always come to mind first are water, plenty of water. So water intake in these cattle will increase by as much as 50% or double. So, you know, 1,000-pound cattle, they'll probably be looking at 35 gallons of water a day need. So the ability to get to adequate water source, replenish the water, anything that's associated with that is extremely helpful. The other thing is any air movement at all that we can help to provide these cattle is a really good thing. As much as 5 miles an hour or better in wind can dissipate a lot of that heat. So in situations where there might be windbreaks or other buildings or structures that block wind, there's a real dead space behind those areas. So we figure for every foot high that a windbreak is, 10 feet distance past that is dead space. So a 10-foot high would have a 100-foot area that would be pretty dead and wouldn't get wind movement.
Should producers look at feeding at different times of the day or feeding a different diet?
Yeah, so the general recommendation is to think about reducing energy densities in those diets. May be somewhat controversial in terms of where that helps or how much that helps. The other thing is change feeding times, maybe feeding much later in the day or in the evening, because when that animal intakes that feed, then he generates heat and digestion, and so they need the opportunity to have that cool off period, following eating that's going to help them.
Richard says flies can also be a problem during warm periods as they can cause cattle to bunch up. He says fly control is therefore important to help allow cattle to dissipate heat. Kip Cullers, who holds the world record for soybean yield, calls them low-hanging fruits, easy to implement, low-cost management practices that produce high returns. In the July Nebraska Farmer, Cullers says there are no silver bullets when it comes to reaching high yields in corn and soybeans. It starts with being willing to change. To learn more insight from Cullers, you can check out the July Nebraska Farmer. Nebraska's corn condition improved slightly this week. The latest crop progress report rates 73% of the crop as good to excellent. That's 1 point better than last week. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says growers still need to be on the lookout and scouting for diseases in fields across the state.
We're still seeing gray leaf spot, we're seeing northern corn leaf blight. Conditions are still right for those diseases, and they'll continue to increase, especially in susceptible hybrids, so we hope people will keep watching them. But we also hope that people are paying close attention. There have been a lot of reports, some unconfirmed reports, of southern rust in states to our south. To this point, we have not confirmed southern rust in Nebraska, so we don't want people to panic, but there is likely that we may see southern rust in the states to our south. We're seeing a lot of it further south into Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, so stay tuned, scout fields, and be prepared to make a treatment decision later.
Next week, we'll get an update on soybean diseases and discuss fungicide applications from Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Lauren Giesler. As we've tracked throughout the growing season, Nebraska's winter wheat crop has had a tough go. Farmers have harvested 27% of the crop, 11 points behind the state's 5-year average. And now Nebraska Extension Stephen Wigulo says excessively wet weather has helped fusarium head blight develop in some fields. That damage could lead to scabby grain and vomitoxin. Because of the food risk to humans, producers might not be able to sell that wheat as before, but UNL Professor Emeritus Terry Kloppenstein says if growers can't, they might be able to find another use for it as cattle feed.
As long as one knows how much vomitoxin is there and keeps it under about 10 parts per million. We've got lots of research that we did in a previous year when it was wet that producers can feed it and not have any problems. We could find no problems if we stayed under that 10 parts per million. So cattle feeders can use this, and wheat can work well as a feed grain. Corn is priced about 80% the price of wheat, but if you adjust for bushel weight and dry matter, it's about 90%. So you don't have just a 10% discount to go from selling wheat milling for milling purposes versus feeding it to cattle.
We'll link to more resources on vomitoxin on the Market Journal website. Next week, we'll look at planting forages into wheat stubble with Nebraska Extension educator Aaron Berger. As you may have heard, UNL is forecasting Nebraska's farm income will drop 45% this year to its lowest mark since 2009. But results from the Nebraska Rural Poll released this week show what could be perceived as an interesting contradiction. Respondents said they were more optimistic about their futures than in any of the previous 20 years of the study. Earlier this week, Nebraska Extension's Brad Lubin joined us to talk about the relationship of the two studies, starting with the numbers on Nebraska farm income.
Well, we analyzed the numbers back in February and March and published them, and then they've more recently been part of a general Nebraska economic forecast that was released earlier in July. But the numbers tell us that farm income is dropping as much as 50% from 2014 to 2015. Well, we know that crop prices have fallen dramatically over that time frame. From record highs in 2012 and 2013, we've fallen 50% or better on those crop prices. The livestock sector is actually still holding very strong. So the drop in farm income is predominantly focused on changing that crop outlook.
So that report was well publicized last week, and this week we see the results of the Nebraska Rural Poll that shows rural residents are as optimistic as ever, more optimistic than ever about the future. Is that somewhat in opposition?
Well, it seems ironic that rural Nebraska is very, very optimistic at the same time that we're saying that farm income is going to drop dramatically. That's true. But we should note that farm income is dropping dramatically, but dramatically from record levels. The new farm income projections for 15 and forward look more in line with the last 10-year average. They just look very low compared to the last 2 or 3 years. And so part of it's a return to more normalcy. Part of the optimism is that the general economy is growing as well. Nebraska agriculture may be 25% of the general economy, 1 in 4 jobs we've calculated, but the general economy matters too, even in rural Nebraska. And so the overall recovery nationally in terms of the general economy, maybe that has increased optimism amongst the general population. It's interesting to note, even the ag sector says they're very optimistic, even as optimistic as ever. And perhaps that's because even with a drop in farm income, we come from record years of farm income that have really strengthened the balance sheet. So very strong position right now.
I suppose we should note that this is not, the Nebraska Rural Poll is not overwhelmingly agriculture. It's only what percent?
Well, the agricultural responses, those that say they are directly involved in agriculture, are about 14% of our respondents. This is a rural poll of rural Nebraska. Well, rural is defined as everything outside of the Lincoln and Omaha metro areas. Agriculture is important, but it's still one of several sectors in that entire area.
You mentioned the growth that Nebraska had seen, now one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation. What about in the future, how Nebraska grows and how that could affect the optimism?
Well, it's interesting. Nebraska is not sort of counter-cyclical to the nation as a whole, but there's a little bit of truth in the fact that during the economic recession that brought down the economic growth nationally, Nebraska fared very well because of a booming agricultural sector, and our dependence on ag, the importance of ag, helped to sort of buoy up Nebraska's agriculture, Nebraska's economy relative to the country. Now perhaps the rest of the country is catching up and the general economy is catching up at the same time that the agricultural sector is slowing down or falling back to more normal levels. That would suggest that the Nebraska economy relative to the national economy ought to slow down. And I think the general economic forecast for the state would suggest that we'll return more to something of a normal growth rate relative to a little bit stronger national economy.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, we did see a scattering of thunderstorm activity, particularly during the midweek period. Most areas that were impacted included the Panhandle, portions of southwest, southeast Nebraska, and then some scattered thunderstorm activity across portions of east central, central, and northeast Nebraska. Where we received precipitation, it was localized heavy. Where we didn't receive precipitation, really much more than just wetting the pavement. And so this dry trend is starting to materialize somewhat over the last couple of weeks. And the big question is, will this be a trend that continues on into the future? Now, we do have a very strong El Nino event ongoing and is expected to intensify as we go into the remainder of the year, possibly eclipsing the previous strong event from the 97, 98 El Nino. So we are looking at the potential for this drying pattern to kind of establish itself. The question is, where will it establish itself, either in the western or the eastern Corn Belt? Right now in the east, they've been inundated with precip event after precip event, particularly from Illinois eastward. And the crops really, to my point, look very ugly. And unfortunately, if we don't see a continuation of this rain and get into a hot, dry spell, we could see the crops really fall apart, because at least for the corn, I think that we're going to be dealing with some very shallow-rooted corn that will be susceptible to intense, hot, dry spells. For us, there is a couple opportunities for precipitation, but it looks like the warm temperatures at least will continue into the foreseeable future. So let's take a look at the upper models and see what we have in store. First of all, we have a trough that's working in the western United States, and we have a major ridge across the lower Mississippi River Valley. That's allowing moisture to be pumped at the lower layers from the Gulf of Mexico, and then we get the monsoon in the mid-layer, moisture coming in, interacting with this front. There's a possibility that we'll start to see some thunderstorm development as we get into the afternoon, late afternoon hours across the Panhandle. Some of these may make their way into central Nebraska during the overnight hours, but more importantly, as this trough races toward the Great Lakes, we will see thunderstorm development across the western part of the state, and as the front of the surface sags southward, we're likely to see scattered thunderstorm activity across the southern half of the state. The lesser chances will occur across northeastern portions of the state. As we go into Monday, that system departs off the east coast. There's another piece of energy that's very weak that moves through the mid layers of the atmosphere that may again touch off thunderstorm activity, particularly across the southern 1/3 of the state. And then as we get into Tuesday, pretty much all the systems pass by us and we start to see some ridging taking place, very weak, but it's an onset of a very warm pattern that should develop by midweek. As this ridge starts to build in, it's going to push the moisture flow to our north. The one thing I will say about the models that I'm using right now are biased more toward the warm side. If this front does sag a little bit farther south, my forecast will be off by a good 5 to 10 degrees. So this is a very shaky forecast at best. As we get into Wednesday, we see this ridge building in, brings the warm air into our region, and it starts to expand by Thursday to include all of the eastern corn belt, and yet another trough approaches from the west that should bring thunderstorm activity into our region as we get into Friday and Saturday next week as it approaches the central Rockies. So the temperature forecast looks like we're going to see warm temperatures across the southern and western portions of the state through the entire period. A little bit cooler up in the northwest this weekend, and then we'll start to see a warming trend as we go through the week. The 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday keeps the warm area in place, and in terms of precipitation, we see the dry trend existing from Texas all the way up into the eastern corn belt.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, moisture conditions in Nebraska, heat stress in cattle, and farm incomes. As always, you can follow Market Journal during the week on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Jeff Peterson will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Purdue University ag economist Mike Bolge will talk about managing in tough agricultural times. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.